Well, hello, Smyrna family, and happy summer. We are going to finish up Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. Chapter 18, Dobby's Reward. For a moment, there was a silence as Harry, Ron, Ginny, and Lockhart stood in the doorway, covered in muck and slime, and in Harry's case, blood. Then there was a scream. Ginny! It was Mrs. Weasley, who had been sitting in front of the fire. She leapt to her feet, closely followed by Mr. Weasley, and both of them flung themselves on their daughter. Harry, however, was looking past them. Professor Dumbledore was standing by the mantelpiece, beaming next to Professor McGonagall, who was taking great steady gasps and clutching her chest. Fawkes went flying past Harry's ear and settled on Dumbledore's shoulder, just as Harry found himself and Ron being swept into Miss Weasley's tight embrace. You saved her! You saved her! How did you do it? I think we'd all like to know that, said Professor McGonagall weakly. Mrs. Weasley let go of Harry, who hesitated for a moment, then walked over to the desk and laid upon it the sorting hat, the ruby-encrusted sword, and what remained of Riddle's diary. Then he started telling them everything. For nearly a quarter of an hour, he spoke in a rasped silence. He told them about hearing the disembodied voice, how Hermione had finally realized that he was hearing a basilisk in the pipes, how he and Ron had followed the spiders into the forest, that Aragog had told them where the last victim of the basilisk had died, how he had guessed that Moaning Myrtle had been the victim, and the entrance to the Chamber of Secrets might be in her bathroom. Very well, Professor McGonagall prompted him as he paused. So you found out where the entrance was, breaking 100 school rules into pieces along the way, I might add. But how on earth did you get out of there alive, Potter? So Harry, his voice now growing hoarse from the talking, told how Fawkes' timely arrival and about the sorting hat giving him the sword. But then he faltered. He had so far avoided mentioning Riddle's diary or Ginny. She was standing with her head against Mrs. Weasley's shoulders. Tears were still coursing down her silent cheeks. What if they expelled her? Harry thought in panic. Riddle's diary didn't work anymore. How could they prove who he'd been, who'd made it do it all? Instinctively, Harry looked at Dumbledore, who smiled faintly, the firelight glancing off his half-moon spectacles. What interests me most, said Dumbledore gently, is how Lord Voldemort managed to enchant Ginny when my sources tell me he is currently hiding in the forest of Albania. Relief, warm, sweeping, glorious relief swept over Harry. What's that? Said Mr. Weasley in a stunned voice. You know who enchanted Ginny? But Ginny hasn't been, has she? It was the diary, said Harry quickly, picking it up and showing it to Dumbledore. Riddle wrote in it when he was 16. Dumbledore took the diary from Harry and peered keenly down his long, crooked nose at its burnt, soggy edges. Brilliant, he said softly. Of course, he was probably the most brilliant student Hogwarts has ever seen. He turned around to the Weasleys, who were looking utterly bewildered. Very few people know that Lord Voldemort was once called Tom Riddle. I taught him myself 50 years ago at Hogwarts. He disappeared after leaving the school, traveled far and wide, sank so deeply into the dark arts, consorted with the very worst of our kind, underwent so many dangerous magical transformations that when he resurfaced as Lord Voldemort, he was barely recognizable. Hardly anyone connected Lord Voldemort with the clever, handsome boy who was once head boy here. But Ginny, said Miss Weasley, what's our Ginny got to do with him? His diary, Ginny sobbed. I've been writing it and he's been writing back all year. Ginny, said Mr. Weasley flabbergasted, haven't I taught you anything? What have I always told you? Never trust anything that can think for itself if you can't see where to keep its brain. Why didn't you show the diary to me or your mother? A suspicious object like that, it was clearly full of dark magic. I don't know, sobbed Ginny. I found it inside one of the books Mom got me. I thought someone had just left it in there and forgotten about it. Miss Weasley should go up to the hospital ring right now. Dumbledore interrupted in a firm voice. This has been a terrible ordeal for her. There will be no punishment. Older and wiser wizards than she have been hoodwinked by Lord Voldemort. He strode over to the door and opened it. Bed rest and perhaps a large steaming mug of hot chocolate. I always find that cheers me up. He winked, twinkling kindly down at her. You will find that Madame Pomfrey is still awake. She's just giving our mandrake juice. I dare say the basilisk victims will be waking up at any moment. So Hermione's okay? Said Ron brightly. There has been no lasting harm done, Ginny, said Dumbledore. Mrs. Weasley led Ginny out, and Mr. Weasley followed, still looking deeply shaken. You know, Minerva, Professor Dumbledore said thoughtfully to Professor McGonagall, I think all this merits a good feast. Might I go and alert the kitchens? Right, said Professor McGonagall crisply, also moving to the door. I shall leave you to deal with Potter and Weasley, shall I? Clearly, said Dumbledore. She left, and Harry and Ron gazed uncertainly at Dumbledore. What exactly had Professor McGonagall meant? Deal with them. Surely they weren't about to be punished. I seem to remember telling you both I would have to expel you if you broke any more rules, said Dumbledore. Ron opened his mouth in horror. Which goes to show you that the best of us must sometimes eat our words, Dumbledore went on, smiling. You will both receive special awards for service to the school. And let me see, yes, I think 200 points apiece for Gryffindor. Ron went as brightly pink as Lockhart's Valentine flowers and closed his mouth again. One of us seems to be keeping mighty quiet about this part of the dangerous adventure, Dumbledore added. Why so modest, Gilderoy? Harry gave a start. He had completely forgotten about Lockhart. He turned and saw that Lockhart was standing in the corner of the room, still wearing his vague smile. When Dumbledore addressed him, Lockhart looked over his shoulder to see who he was talking to. Professor Dumbledore, Ron said quickly. There was an accident down in the Chamber of Secrets. Professor Lockhart. Am I a professor? Said Lockhart in a mild surprise. Goodness, I expect I was hopeless, was I? He tried to do a memory charm and the wand backfired, Ron explained quietly to Dumbledore. Dear me, said Dumbledore, shaking his head, his long silver mustache quivering. Impaled upon your own sword, Gilderoy. Sword, said Lockhart dimly. Haven't got a sword. That boy has, though, he pointed to Harry. I'll lend you one. Who would mind taking Professor Lockhart up to the infirmary, too? Dumbledore said to Ron. I'd like a few more words with Harry. Lockhart ambled out. Ron cast a curious look back at Dumbledore and Harry as he closed the door. Dumbledore crossed to one of the chairs by the fire. Sit down, Harry, he said, and Harry sat, feeling unaccountably nervous. First of all, Harry, I want to thank you, said Dumbledore, eyes twinkling again. You must have shown me real loyalty down there in the chamber. Nothing but that could have called Fawkes to you. He stroked the phoenix, which had fluttered down onto his knee. Harry grinned awkwardly at Dumbledore and watched him. And so you met Tom Riddle, said Dumbledore thoughtfully. I imagine he was of most interest to you. Suddenly, something that was nagging at Harry came tumbling out of his mouth. Professor Dumbledore, Riddle said I'm like him. Strange likenesses, he said. Did he now? And Dumbledore, looking thoughtfully at Harry from under his thick silver eyebrows, said, And what do you think, Harry? I don't think I'm like him, said Harry, more loudly than he intended. I mean, I'm in Gryffindor. But he fell silent, a lurking doubt resurfacing in his mind. Professor, he started again after a moment, the Sorting Hat told me I'd have done well in Slytherin. Everyone thought I was Slytherin's heir for a while because I can speak Parseltongue. You can speak Parseltongue, Harry? Said Dumbledore calmly. Because Lord Voldemort, who is the last remaining ancestor of Salazar Slytherin, can speak Parseltongue. Unless I'm much mistaken, he transferred some of his own powers to you the night he gave you that scar. Not something he intended to do, I'm sure. Voldemort put a bit of himself in me? Harry said, thunderstruck. It certainly seems so. So I should be a Slytherin, said Harry, looking desperately into Dumbledore's face. The Sorting Hat could see Slytherin's power in me, and it put you in Gryffindor, said Dumbledore calmly. Listen to me, Harry. You happen to have many qualities of Salazar Slytherin, prized in his hand-picked students. His own very rare gift, Parseltongue, resourcefulness, determination, a certain disregard for rules, he added, his mustache quivering again. Yet the Sorting Hat placed you in Gryffindor. You know why that was? Think. It only put me in Gryffindor, said Harry in a defeated voice, because I asked not to go in Slytherin. Exactly, said Dumbledore, beaming once more, which makes you very different from Tom Riddle. It is our choices, Harry, that show who we truly are more than our abilities. Harry sat motionless in a chair, stunned. If you want proof, Harry, that you belong in Gryffindor, I suggest you look most closely at this. Dumbledore reached across to Professor McGonagall's desk, picked up the blood-stained silver sword, and handed it to Harry. Dully, Harry turned it over, the rubies blazing in the firelight, and then he saw the name engraved just below the hilt. Godric Gryffindor. Only a true Gryffindor could have pulled that out of the hat, Harry, said Dumbledore simply. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Dumbledore pulled open one of the drawers in McGonagall's desk and took out a quill and a bottle of ink. What you need, Harry, is some food and some sleep. I suggest you go down to the feast while I write to Azkaban's. We need our gameskeeper back. And I must draft an advertisement in the Daily Prophet, too, he added thoughtfully. We'll be needing a new defense against the dark arts, teacher. Dear me, we do seem to run through them, don't we? Harry got up and crossed to the door. He had just reached for the handle, however, when the door burst open so violently that it bounced back off the wall. Lucius Malfoy stood there, fury in his face. And cowering behind his legs, heavily wrapped in bandages, was Dobby. Good evening, Lucius, said Dumbledore pleasantly. Mr. Malfoy almost knocked Harry over as he swept into the room. Dobby went scurrying in after him, crouching at the hem of his cloak, a look of abject horror on his face. The elf was carrying a strained rag with which he was attempting to finish cleaning Mr. Malfoy's shoes. Apparently, Mr. Malfoy had set out in a great hurry, for not only were his shoes half polished, but his usually sleek hair was disheveled. Ignoring the elf bobbing apologetically around his ankles, he fixed his cold eyes upon Dumbledore. So, he said, you've come back. The governor suspended you, but you saw fit to return to Hogwarts? Well, you see, Lucius, said Dumbledore, smiling serenely, the other 11 governors contacted me today. It was something like being caught in a hailstorm of owls, to tell you the truth. They'd heard that Arthur Weasley's daughter had been killed and wanted me back here at once. They seem to think that I am the best man for the job after all. Very strange tales they told me, too. Several of them seemed to think that you had threatened to curse their families if they didn't agree to suspend me in the first place. Mr. Malfoy went even paler than usual, but his eyes were still slits of fury. So, have you stopped the attacks yet? He sneered. Have you caught the culprit? We have, said Dumbledore with a smile. Well, said Mr. Malfoy sharply. Who is it? The same person as last time, Lucius, said Dumbledore. But this time, Lord Voldemort was acting through somebody else by means of his diary. He held up a small black book with a large hole through the center. Watching Mr. Malfoy closely, Harry, however, was watching Dobby. The elf was doing something very odd. His great eyes fixed meaningfully on Harry. He kept pointing to the diary, then at Mr. Malfoy, and then hitting himself hard on the head with his fist. I see, said Mr. Malfoy slowly to Dumbledore. A clever plan, said Dumbledore in a clear voice, still staring Mr. Malfoy straight in the eye. Because of Harry here. Mr. Malfoy shot a swift look at Harry. and his friend Ron hadn't discovered the book, why, Ginny Weasley might have taken all the blame. No one would have ever been able to prove that she hadn't acted out of her own free will. Mr. Malfoy said nothing. His face was suddenly mask-like. And imagine, Dumbledore went on, what might have happened. The Weasleys are one of our most prominent pureblood families. Imagine the effect on Arthur Weasley and his Muggle Protection Act if his very own daughter was discovered attacking and killing Muggleborns. Very fortunate the diary was discovered and Riddle's memories wiped from it. Who knows what the consequences might have been otherwise? Mr. Malfoy forced himself to speak. Very fortunate, he said stiffly. And still behind his back, Dobby was pointing first at the diary, then at Lucius Malfoy, then punching himself in the head. And Harry suddenly understood. He nodded at Dobby, and Dobby backed into a corner, now twisting his ears in punishment. Don't you want to know how Ginny got a hold of that diary, Mr. Malfoy? Said Harry. Lucius Malfoy rounded on him. How should I know how that stupid little girl got a hold of it, he said. Because you gave it to her, said Harry. And Flourish and Bots. You picked up her old Transfiguration book, slipped the diary inside it, didn't you? He saw Mr. Malfoy's white hands clench and unclench. Prove it, he hissed. Oh, no one will be able to do that, said Dumbledore, smiling at Harry. Not now that Riddle has vanished back into the book. On the other hand, I would advise you, Lucius, not to go giving out any more of Lord Voldemort's old school things. If any more of them were to find their way back into innocent hands, I think Arthur Weasley, for one, will make sure that they are traced back to you. Lucius Malfoy stood for a moment, and Harry distinctly saw his right hand twitch, as though he was longing to reach for his wand. Instead, he turned to his house elf. We're going, Dobby. He wrenched open the door, and as the elf came hurrying up to him, he kicked him right through it. They could hear Dobby squealing with pain all the way along the corridor. Harry stood for a moment, thinking hard. Then it came to him. Professor Dumbledore, he said hurriedly, can I give that diary back to Mr. Malfoy, please? Certainly, Harry, said Dumbledore calmly. But remember, the feast, remember? Harry grabbed the diary and dashed out of the office. He could hear Dobby's squeals of pain receding around the corner. Quickly, wondering if this plan could possibly work, Harry took off one of his shoes, pulled off his sock, and stuffed it into the diary, and then ran down the dark corridor.